Well, they find and share stories about their beloved city that you don't always discover in newspapers and museums. They call themselves the Laurel History Boys, a trio that brings together memorabilia, photos, and old stories for generations to come. We recently caught up with part of the trio at their weekly hangout.
It was just surreal. So I just started posting, these little memory trigger images of shopping bags from Zayre's, or things that people will remember when they see it. They're like, oh my God, I haven't thought about that in a long time.
When Richard Friend first started his book Lost Laurel, it was because he felt a sense of nostalgia for the town's past.
And it all really, as I mentioned, it stemmed from me when I moved away, and then I would come back and I'd find that basically everything that I knew as a kid was slowly but surely disappearing. Even the mall, which I was there when it was built in 1979 and it opened, and then suddenly to see it close, and you saw the steady decline, but then it's finally closed and torn down, and it was just surreal.
Richard Friend and Kevin Leonard make up 2/3 of a trio called the Laurel History Boys. You'll often find them at the local diner, where they have their own booth and are friends with the staff. The trio has been gathering long-forgotten mementos and stories of a time past, including one of the most notorious, the shooting of presidential candidate George Wallace at Laurel Shopping Center.
So I wrote about the investigative files, which is kind of a different thing. There were some really bizarre things in there about Bremer, about how they investigated things, what they uncovered. There was tons and tons of interviews with civilians and police and Secret Service, and it's the longest column I've written.
The trio also found a surprising connection to World War I veterans in this old 1930s newsreel. When vets returning from France were told they had to wait 15 years for a promised bonus, they marched on Washington. Soon after, the Depression kicked in and the men became destitute. Calling themselves the Bonus Army, the group ended up setting up a permanent camp in Laurel.
But a lot of them wanted to stay and continue the fight, and a lady who lives in Catonsville donated her land, which was between Laurel and Fort Meade, for a permanent camp. And some of the footage that I found shows them actually clearing the land for this camp.
Sometimes the research leads them on a gruesome trail, such as Laurel's first mass murder or the history of a long-forgotten vacant lot in Maryland City.
I found that it was a gentleman who had basically killed himself. He had wired the house to explode at the time that he killed himself. And it was a gruesome story. And I mean, you think of kids, and you said you were there. I mean, you grew up at that time. And then to see, that a different house is there, because the house is completely destroyed. And now it's like everything else was built in the 60s, but that one was built in 1984. And it's just a bizarre story that you would otherwise have been lost to history.
And I was surprised to learn that this story was one I witnessed myself back in high school. That long-forgotten lot was just up the street from my childhood home.
And it was a day I would never forget. Well, next week we will take a look at one particular piece of Laurel history, the old sanitarium. Be sure to tune in. If you'd like more information about the trio and their collection of news and memorabilia, you can visit laurelhistory.com. Well, last week we told you about a trio that calls itself the Laurel History Boys. The group collects memorabilia from the city's past and brings long-forgotten stories back to life. One of those stories took place in a part of Laurel that no longer has a trace of its history, a place that once held the Laurel Sanitarium.
Well, sanitariums were very popular around the turn of the century.
Kevin Leonard says sanitariums were so popular that the city had several back in the early 1900s. Leonard, who is part of the trio known as the Laurel History Boys, researched the one located behind what is now Laurel Shopping Center.
They were used instead of regular hospitals by a lot of people because it was very easy to get people committed. And so they generally specialized in mental illness and addiction. And so they would, families would have someone admitted to that, and then they would never come home again.
Laurel Sanitarium was founded in 1905 by Dr. Jesse Coggins. The owner converted an old farmhouse into the administration building. Men and women were housed in a second building until Coggins bought a new hotel.
It was about a half a mile away, and they moved it here. And the way they did that, it was a T-shaped hotel. And they actually jacked it up and slid it down a ramp, a greased ramp onto greased telephone poles. And then a team of horses. This was in, by the way, this was in 1905 or 1906. A team of horses then pulled it for that half mile all the way from here to the grounds, and where they put it back up and made it into a men's dormitory.
The facilities were shut down in the 1960s after the owner's death.
After that, his wife just shut it down, and it eventually sat vacant for quite a while. It became a landmark for people to come out and check out, and it was kind of spooky. The fire department came and they did a controlled burn on it, and they just got rid of it that way.
Back in the day, this whole area was a big field, part of the sanitarium grounds. The 3 buildings that made up the site were located right where this white building is over my shoulder. Most of the beautifully manicured land was sold to developers of Laurel Shopping Center along Route 1. Another section later became part of Laurel High School.
And if you'd like to learn some more information about the sanitarium or the city's long-forgotten past, you can follow the trio at laurelhistory.com.